Good afternoon, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind Online with Michael Schmidt and Jay Schreiber. They'll be talking about Mike's controversial New York Times bestseller, Donald Trump versus the United States. I'm Ariel Zeitlin, Montclair's programming librarian, and here are a few housekeeping details. My colleague Molly, thank you, Molly. Okay, so whether you're using a phone, a tablet, or a computer, you have the same controls in GoToWebinar. Here's the question mark or chat box, which is your link to me and to my librarian co-host, Molly Hone, during the webcast. You can use it to get live tech help from Molly, and you'll also use it to send us your questions for the Q&A with the author at the end. Thank you, Molly. Now, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Dan Phillips, who's a member of the board of our Montclair Library Foundation.
Thanks, Ariel. Hi, we're so pleased that you are all here for our third webcast of Open Book, Open Mind Online. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Foundation. We're a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise funds that help make possible many of the free programs and services that make our library so special. On average, the Foundation's fundraising supports about 5% of the library's budget, and were utilized by the library as a source of opportunistic investment. As we've progressed through the pandemic, the Foundation has been tapped to support the significant growth in e-content. For example, between March and April, Overdrive Libby, an e-platform book, was up 59%. Canopy, an entertainment service, was up 119%. Hoopla, another ebook entertainment platform, was up 102%, and online library card registrations were up 93%. In these unprecedented times, the Montclair Public Library remains a constant thanks to the caring support of generous donors like you. Please consider donating to your library through our website, mplf.org. A gift of any size will have an impact. And now enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We really appreciate all that you do, and we certainly couldn't go on without you. Now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Michael Schmidt. Michael S. Schmidt is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington correspondent for the New York Times. Over his 15 years at the Times, he has covered the investigations of the Trump presidency, the Pentagon, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the war in Iraq. Mike has broken many of the major stories of the Trump era, from the news of Hillary Clinton's use of a personal email account to the report on former FBI Director James Comey's contemporaneous memos of conversations with Trump that led directly to the appointment of Special Counsel Robert Mueller III. In this election year, we are especially proud to present Michael in conversation about his book, which The Guardian called a masterful and alarming account of the struggle to stop a president. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so pleased that you can make it. And now I'm very happy to introduce Michael's friend and former editor at the New York Times and his conversation partner this afternoon. Jay Schreiber was a deputy editor at the New York Times for over 25 years. He's also a longtime resident of Montclair. Thank you for joining us, Jay. Jay?
Yes, hold on one second.
Okay, hang on there. Here we go. Okay, and now the moment you've all been waiting for. I'm going to disappear, but I'll be back to read the questions for our audience Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, Michael. Good to see you. And good afternoon, everybody who's taking part on this webinar. Let me just take a second to add to your resume. you won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, but you did so in the same year, which is really hard to do. And one of them was for your reporting on the Trump White House and the Russia investigation. The other was for the sexual harassment scandals at Fox News, and which was sort of amazing because you came from Washington to New York to help do that story, and it was almost like you were a hitman brought in to get that story over the finish line, and you did. So, and I should mention that I had nothing to do with either story. You and I worked together much earlier in your career when you were a young reporter in the sports department, and you went from 0 to 60 in about 5 seconds and basically just took over the whole story of the steroid scandal that was rocking baseball. From there came Iraq and then Washington. And in addition to all the achievements that you've compiled, you've now written a really well-written, really well-reported book that really, I think, gives people, a reader, a feel for just what has been going on in the White House the last few years as Trump took over and then had to deal with the investigation into whether his campaign had collaborated with the Russians. The book is divided into Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and Act 4. And I suppose right now, in this country, all of us are now in Act 5. And so with that in mind, I thought we should begin not with the book, but just with your thoughts about 2 events that occurred this week. The debate on Tuesday night, and of course, the fact that now Trump is in the hospital. Let's start with the debate. You've observed Trump really closely for the last few years. Was there anything about that debate, his behavior, that surprised you?
Well, thanks for doing this. And it's really special to have you do this because we spent so much of our time together. And, you know, I miss working with you a lot, actually. I can't believe I'm admitting that. But so the thing, and I was saying to someone the other day, I said, you know, the cliche is, and I didn't want to use the cliche. And the person said back to me, he said, well, cliches are cliches because they make sense. And, you know, in newspapering, we sort of look down upon them because we think of them as bad writing and such, and they're cliches. But I keep on coming back to this. One is that I've lost ways to describe the moment. I just run out of adjectives, extraordinary, remarkable, it's ridiculous to just try and put anything on it. But the cliche and the most important thing is that all of this was extremely predictable, but nonetheless, it's shocking. His behavior at the debate was very predictable. If you look at how he acts when, you know, he feels like he's in a corner, when he feels like he's the underdog, and just how he behaves in general. That was him, you know, pure and simple. And I was a little surprised to see Chris Wallace say that he didn't think it was going to get to be that bad, and as if he didn't have a plan on how to do that. I don't totally fault Chris Wallace because I'm not exactly sure how you stop that. And that sort of is a theme of the book and a theme of the entire thing. You know, the struggle to stop a president, whether it's the people around the president, the Jim Comeys of the world, or the Don McGahns, the Congress, Democrats, or Chris Wallace. The president is very difficult to stop because he's willing to do things that few others are willing to do. If you were up on that debate stage and you got carried away and you were interrupting and such, and Chris Wallace pushed back at you, my guess is that you would stop because you'd be afraid of humiliation and you'd be afraid of looking too aggressive and such. In Donald Trump's case, you cannot deter him. So those who you cannot deter can end up being effective in ways that others cannot. If you had been running for president and you, in a complete mistaken moment, said the comments about John McCain, where Trump said that if John McCain had been caught, you know, that he didn't like, you know, folks who had been caught. you liked, soldiers who were not caught. If you had said that, you would have come out and profusely apologize and say that you're receding from public life and have gone home, and saying that you're going to spend the rest of your life repenting for what you did. Donald Trump was emboldened by that. So that happened in 2015, I believe. So the behavior, Donald Trump is like sort of, for someone who's inconsistent, fairly consistent. So the behavior at the debate did not surprise me. Same thing with the COVID outbreak. We're all self-appointed epidemiologists in the country now. And as a self-appointed epidemiologist, it was pretty clear to me that the way that he was behaving and looking and treating the virus, that he was making himself susceptible to get it. So the fact that he got it and ended up either around a super spreader or being a super spreader or participating in a bunch of super spreading events and affecting the people around him and ending up in the hospital as someone who, whatever his health is probably not great, not really surprising. Shocking nonetheless that the president's in the hospital, not surprising that we do not have a full accounting of what's going on, of his medical status, not surprising given you want to start with crowd sizes and move forward. This is a White House that has a demented relationship with the truth. So why would it be that when they are under a microscope at the most intense of moments about an issue the president's incredibly sensitive on, why are we surprised that they're not providing the truth? Shocking nonetheless.
Okay, that was great. I think you answered both. I was going to ask you your reaction to the fact that he's now battling a virus that he spent so much time belittling, but you've given the answer. So let's get to the book. In addition to Trump, of course, it centers on two people in particular who you just mentioned. One is James Comey, who was the director of the FBI when Trump took over in the White House, and then he fired Comey. And the other is Don McGahn, who was a lot less of a public figure than Comey, probably not even, I would bet, not that familiar to many of the people listening in now on this webinar. But he was the White House counsel for much of the events that are in your book. And it's these two people that you chose because you saw them both in different ways trying to deal with the unrestrained behavior of Trump and try to find a way to contain him. And it's compelling reading. And so let's start with McGahn, in part because you start the book with McGahn. And it begins with a very sort of intriguing, the book begins with a very intriguing, kind of almost amusing scene. It's a warm, humid night in the summer of 2018 in Washington. One of your editors has just spotted McGahn walking back to the White House, I guess from dinner. You're nearby at the bureau, at the New York Times Bureau, and you start running. You're running on foot to try and grab him before he presumably walks through the gates and goes back up the driveway into the White House and back to his office. You really want to talk to him. And you really want to run as fast as you can to get him, although, of course, if you run too fast, you're afraid that the Secret Service won't know what to make of you and they'll just pounce on you. Anyway, take it from there. Why were you so intent? What did you know about McGahn at that point? And why were you so intent on getting him before he was out of reach?
So to me, the most important figure in the Trump era besides Donald Trump is Don McGahn. And there's three reasons why that's the case. The first is that he is in charge of the most important political thing to the president, and that's the judges. He, in only the Trumpian sense, Trump has entrusted in him the ability to pick the judges. He's essentially going to be a committee of one. McGahn is going to come up with the judges and bring them to Trump. And there's all of these seats open when they come into office on the courts, particularly on the Supreme Court. And McGahn is like almost an ideologue on the issue of judges. He believes that he's an ardent libertarian. The federal government has run amok, and he wants to put Scalia's and Thomas's on the court. And he doesn't just want to put Scalia's and Thomas's, but he wants to put people like that are in their 40s, who will be on the court for decades to come. And he full-throatedly takes this on, embraces it, and smash-mouthly remakes the court. Now, that's significant because we'll be living in Don McGahn's America for decades to come, maybe let's say 40 years. But it's even more important to Trump politically, because what it does is it creates what I call this umbilical cord between Trump and his base. It shows the base that while he may behave in ways that the base finds very unappealing, he is willing to put the people on the courts, which conservatives see as probably their best bet to getting what they want in this country. He's willing to do that. And that's important because it insulates him from his own behavior. He can behave in such unprecedented, unusual ways that that base is going to stay with him. And you see that in impeachment. When we get all the way to impeachment at the beginning of this year, it was earlier this year, hard to believe. When you get there, there is one Republican that votes to convict Trump in the Senate on one of the counts. That's it. So they were together lockstep. And I do not believe they would have been together like that had it not been for the judges. The second thing is that he's a container of Trump. He's trying to stop Trump from hurting himself, hurting the country and such. And that is, you know, we sort of say that like, oh, you know, he was one of the people trying to stop the president. But that is not the way that the government usually works. For all of time, when we have looked at the presidency, we have looked at how presidents use their power. We look at how they use their power. The people around them help them do that. We don't usually concentrate on how the people around the president, particularly their White House counsel, who's basically supposed to be there to enable them to do what they want to do, trying to stop them. So what is it like to try and stop a president, to be standing between the president and the abyss? And the third thing, and the thing that I probably found the most intriguing about McGahn, is that he was a witness against his client as a lawyer. So in any federal investigation, you're looking for that sort of silver bullet of a witness to use to tell the story, to be the narrator, someone who's got great proximity, someone who is truthful, has a good handle on the truth, who takes notes to back up what they're going to do. Who is that narrator? And because of a series of highly unusual things, he becomes the chief witness against his client, and Trump doesn't even know it. And he is used in ways by prosecutors against his client to damage Trump in ways that probably no other president had been damaged before, using his lawyer. You know, we often think of lawyers, for those of us who pay attention to federal investigations a lot, as sort of these protected group that prosecutors never get to. If you could only get to John Gotti's lawyer, what would you have found out? You know, if you could only have gotten to the person under investigation's lawyer, you would really learn a lot. They had him as a witness against Trump. Nonetheless, despite all of those things, despite these forces being pulled at McGahn, he stayed on as White House counsel because he knew that he had this never and again opportunity to remake the courts. And he believed so much in it. He's sort of a masochist who was willing to put up with behavior that he knew was wrong, people that he knew may not be good, and the children around the president who McGahn had deep concerns about. He's willing to put up with all of this because he knows that if he, and this is in the spring of 2018, his lawyer is concerned about the fact that he is, you know, look, if you're a defense lawyer and you have a client who's hanging out with the gang, that, you know, the gang's under investigation, and when your client hangs out with the gang, he get into trouble, the lawyer's saying to him, saying, look, you got to go. You got to get out. You know, this Mueller report's going to come out. Trump's going to see, you know, what you said. And McGahn is saying to himself, he's saying, I need to stay, because he thinks he can hear in Kennedy's voice. This is Justice Kennedy in the spring of 2018. You think he can hear in Kennedy's voice that Kennedy wants to retire, and that Kennedy will not retire if McGahn leaves. So McGahn and Kennedy had a good relationship, and Kennedy is afraid about what will come after him. And if McGahn is not there to shepherd along the process of picking the judge, then Donald Trump's going to put a Fox News analyst on the court, and Kennedy won't retire, and the chance to fill that seat will not be complete. So McGahn, despite being a witness against his client, despite seeing behavior that he knew was wrong, despite realizing that he cannot stop a president, says, if I can just stay in the ring through June of 2018, then I'll know whether Kennedy will retire and I'll get another shot at the court. And what happens? Kennedy retires and he gets Trump to pick Kavanaugh.
As I was reading, and McGahn is probably the single most compelling figure in the book. I almost felt like a keeping score as a baseball fan. Like, how many times does he write a resignation letter, or is he about to hand in his resignation letter? Is it twice, 3 times? McGahn, right?
I can think of 2 times off the top of my head,
right?
But there's probably a third in there somewhere.
Right, and then how many times does Trump tell him to fire Mueller? Mueller. One of them happens only 6 days after Mueller has been named special counsel. Is that right?
It's a little more than that, but it's right afterwards. Basically, in May of 2017, that's just a few months into the presidency, Trump obviously fires Comey. That creates this massive thing. Mueller is appointed, and despite firing Comey and the huge reaction that it created, Trump, less than a month later, wants to fire Mueller. He thinks Mueller has conflict of interest issues and that Mueller's got to go. He's completely undeterred. And that kind of gets back to something we were talking about earlier, this theme about Trump, is that he's surprisingly consistent. He's never changed his behavior. He came to Washington and he had a choice to make. He could have adapted to Washington and basically said, okay, this is a different place than New York. There's different rules. There's different perceptions about things. I'm the most powerful person in the world. I'm going to change my behavior. Or he could stay the same. And he has largely stayed the same, despite suffering immense political consequence because of it. As I say in the book, Trump can't take a punch, but he can take a beating better than anyone else. Like, he cannot take the day-to-day criticism and it drives him crazy, but he trudges on despite that and refusing to change his behavior. He trudges on in ways that certainly I think no other politician has.
What you just said made me want to just make a quick detour back to the fact that he's in the hospital now, and you say he never changes. Is there any thought in your mind that the fear of going through what he's going through, the ordeal of going through what he's going through right now, might temper his behavior, make him change a little bit, or you think just forget that? I'm dreaming to think that.
I mean, how many times have we said, well, if this happens, he'll change the behavior. If he wins the nomination of the Republican Party, he'll have to pretend to be more of a regular candidate. If he wins the election in the transition, he's going to have to act more presidential. If he becomes president, he's going to have to change. If there's a special counsel, he's going to have to change. If there's an impeachment, he's going to have to change. If there's a virus, he's going to have to change. If he's sick, he's going to have to change. So we can sit here and continue to apply what I call pre-Trump conventional wisdom to this situation, but he's for someone who's erratic, he's consistent. And I'd be very surprised if we came out of this and he was, a different person.
That would make a very good headline. For someone who's erratic, he's consistent. It really sort of captures whatever you want to call it, his lunacy. Now let's get to Comey, the other central figure. He becomes the linchpin for one of your, perhaps the most, I guess you would say the most significant story that came out during the last few years, because it's the way Trump approached him and the notes that Comey took, which eventually were given to you to write this kind of earth-shattering scoop that led to the Mueller investigation and to where we are now. So why don't you take us through how that happened. You knew Comey. I think you knew Comey before you started covering the White House because you had covered the FBI, correct?
Yeah, but I mean, more to the point of my relationship with you, the in 2006, I'm a clerk on the sports desk, and Tom Jolly says we need someone to cover off the field legal issues in drugs and sports because none of the reporters wanted to do that, and sports was becoming engulfed by a federal investigation out of the Bay Area. And I start doing stories as a clerk on this issue, and you say to me that we need to get someone to explain to us what's going on because like we have no idea. You're a sports guy. I'm a 22-year-old, 23-year-old clerk, and there's now a federal investigation that's blossoming over baseball. And you say call one of the law schools in the area to find someone who wants to get quoted and will explain this stuff to us. And in that process, I find this professor who ends up at Columbia University named Dan Richmond. Now, Dan Richmond came up as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York with a lanky, ambitious prosecutor named James Comey. And it is, I build this relationship with Richmond as a sports reporter in which he becomes my tutor in federal investigations. He's the person who gets on the phone and explains to me all these things that you and I are covering basically in the next 3 years as baseball, goes through the Mitchell report and Bonds gets indicted and A-Rod and all the other nonsense. And what happens is that many years later, his friend Jim Comey becomes the FBI director. And then Jim Comey gets fired, and I'm in constant contact with Richmond about what happened here, because I'm getting some inclination from my other reporting that there was some real tension and issues around Comey's relationship with Trump. And as I lay out in the book, it's Richmond who in May of 2017 calls me and reads to me this memo that Comey had written about how Trump asked him to end the investigation into the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. And it's that story, the day after that story, that Mueller was appointed as the special counsel. And this all happening in this period after the Comey firing, where I'm starting to chart and figure out Comey kept memos, Trump asked Comey for his loyalty, and the story about Flynn being the sort of most momentous of those stories. And really, it's interesting. At the time, it was a huge deal. I'm not sure if it came out today, it would be as big a deal because we've seen so much behavior since then. But I think it's significant because it's sort of the first example. It's the first example of Trump looking like he's using his powers as president to protect himself. We've seen a lot of behavior that's come since then, but because it's sort of the first instance that we learn about, it may take on a bigger meaning than it would if we learned about it today. We found out today that Trump asked, FBI Director Chris Wray to end the investigation into Michael Flynn. I'm not sure that'd even be a story. I mean, maybe it would be a story.
And there's a very compelling moment when you've had the memo leaked to you. Goldman has read it to you over the phone. Your colleagues, you're in this intense everyday competition with the Washington Post on this story. And it creates a lot of tension at times when you feel they're ahead of you, which happens all the time in the newspaper business. It's like you got to really keep your poise about it and then get back. And now you've got you and your colleagues and your editors have this great story, and they're literally standing over your shoulder in the bureau, and they want you to push the button and publish it. It's an unbelievable scoop. However, you're waiting, because it's the way this kind of story should be done. You're waiting for a response from the White House, and you're waiting and waiting and waiting. And I know what that is like. And you get justifiably paranoid that they're out to get you. Well, how? Taking the fact that they know what you've got and they're going to feed it to somebody who's more a different news site that's more sympathetic, Fox News, and they'll twist it and make it seem like not such a bad story and also deprive you of your scoop. And you're pushing back and saying, you got to wait. And it's just like a really, ultimately the White House did get back to you. You hit the button and you ended up with a great story that is at the heart of the book. I bring that up also because I think one of the great things in your book is that it really weaved through it is just what it's like to be at the top of your game, to be a high-level reporter on one of the biggest stories in the country's history, and to use every improvisational skill you've got, every tool to try and report. So the things that are in the book, they're kind of amazing. You're meeting a source at the airport at 4 a.m. and driving around in your mom's 14-year-old Volvo station wagon. And the reason you're doing that is you're driving around the deserted streets at 4 a.m. No one's going to see you. No one's going to see a source. No one's going to put two and two together. And that's how he basically gives whatever information he wants. You, not only do you grab him again in front of the White House, but you sit at a bar because you know he's in a restaurant and you just sit there having a make-believe conversation with your colleague so you can grab him on the way out. And that worked. You outfox everybody at Mar-a-Lago one Christmas time when you're all by yourself in the clubhouse dining room with Trump. You're about to get your own interview with him.
All right. Enough of the greatest hits. What's the question?
All right. Anyway, all these reporters don't even know what's going on. And yet, to keep his attention, you walk over to him and you kneel down, you said like a catcher, because you wanted him to look at you rather than look around and get distracted. And it worked. You got the interview. So all those things, I think, really add to the book. But then we get finally to something you feel compelled to do toward the end of the book. You and a colleague go and knock on the door, just go unannounced to two houses that where two of Mueller's investigators live, and you go and knock on the door because you need to talk to them. It's a really awkward thing you're working on. You can't get them, and you feel you have no other resource but to do that. So why did you have to do that?
So we're trying to report about Mueller's acuity, which is a pretty sensitive subject to report on anyone's acuity. And it's clear to us that from the Trump bar side of the world, there's this information coming out about how Mueller may be diminished. And what we're trying to say, I felt pretty good about this information. I accumulated different anecdotes about sort of Mueller's diminished role and, looking like Mueller had lost a step and losing a step more than in the sense of just old age. Just, there was something greater going on with him. And I thought that the issue of his acuity was fair game because not concluded, but I believe that the personality of the person overseeing a special counsel investigation is almost as important to the direction of that investigation as the evidence in the case itself. The personality of Lawrence Walsh in Iran-Contra or of Ken Starr in Whitewater, I think is hugely impactful on the direction. And it was clear that Mueller, from my reporting, was nowhere to be seen. And I thought that was pretty odd. And I thought that Mueller at this point had not testified. And what we were basically trying to say to the Mueller people was like, look, it's clear that there's something off about Mueller. I think you probably should get in front and try and tell this story before it goes any further. And we're trying to make that appeal to them in different ways that I lay out in the book. They didn't, as I lay out in the book, there's no engagement other than the fact that they get a message back to me that I was completely wrong that there was nothing wrong with Mueller. And then there was a message that was sort of offensive that I was asking these questions. And then Mueller testifies, some weeks later after we take a shot at this, and there was clearly something diminished about him. His performance was, he provided, he had a loose sense of the facts. He was very shaky. This was a person in Mueller who had testified before Congress, probably more so than any other American, given the fact that he was an FBI director for 12 years. He was a senior Justice Department official before that, as FBI director, testifying at least once or twice a quarter, and providing a woefully inaccurate answer on one of the central questions of the report's findings. And as I write about in the book, as I later find out that Mueller really struggled to remember basic facts about the investigation in these practice sessions in the lead up to his testimony. And I will say it's obviously everyone's choice whether to tell their story or not, but Mueller has, by his team, sort of letting the report speak for themselves, have had the report completely undermined. The report has been shredded first by the Attorney General, who was able to take it in different directions and manipulate it in favor of the president. Republicans picked up the pieces from there and were able to turn the report into something else. And even more recently by a prosecutor from Mueller's office, Andrew Weissman, who laid out how the office didn't go far enough. And a year and a half or so after the complete of the Mueller report, you've also had Barr try and throw out the case against Michael Flynn, sort of the substantively, maybe not the most important case, but in the public's mind, probably the most important case that they had. The Barr asked for a reduction on the sentencing of Roger Stone and then Trump pardoning him. So the Mueller legacy really, really tarnished and undermined. And I think that's pretty clear.
So you think, is it fair to say, looking back, a younger, more assertive Mueller might have led to a more assertive Mueller report that might have said, which would have made a definitive statement on whether there was obstruction of justice or not?
I mean, let's say Jim Comey was the special counsel, just for the sake of this argument. You think that Jim Comey, one, would have just said that we cannot say whether the president broke the law or not, and then would have left it up to the president's attorney general and Bill Barr to sculpt the findings of his investigation for the public? I mean, Comey's an extreme example, but I think that, look, there's disagreements always on a prosecutorial team, but, Andrew Weissman, this prosecutor, just wrote this book about Mueller's investigation, saying that they should have made a decision on obstruction of justice. I understand why they didn't make a decision. I understand their rationale. It is very, very difficult to understand. And I understand it because I studied it. But it's, I think that, they really, they didn't look at Trump's finances. They didn't look at Trump's taxes. They didn't look at whether he was compromised by Russia. And I think that if I were them, I would, the more and more that comes out about Trump and Russia, the more and more that it casts doubt on their report. So, and I think from the media's perspective and from the public's perspective, Mueller was sort of made out to be like he was going to go up to the, and come down and provide clarity to everything. That certainly didn't happen.
And there's one other person I think that's worth asking about in regards to this, which is Rod Rosenstein, who Trump, with all his inane nicknames, he calls him Mr. Peepers, which is based on a 1950s situation comedy. It's actually not a bad nickname in this one instance. Early on in the book, you say that Comey is wary of Rosenstein, who becomes the Assistant Attorney General, right, in charge of the Mueller investigation. He's wary of him because he thinks that Rosenstein is a survivor. Somehow, somebody who can work with Republicans and Democrats makes him a little uneasy that the guy does whatever he has to do to survive. And your book uncovers something really interesting about Rosenstein, which, go ahead, describe what, and in fact, it really kind of impeded the Mueller investigation, I guess you could say, in a way, right? It impeded the whole investigation, I guess.
So the most monumental decision that is made about Trump investigative wise happens in the days after the Comey firing. And that's the FBI's decision to open a two-pronged investigation of the president. Investigation into whether he obstructed justice, that's a criminal investigation, and an investigation into whether he's compromised by his ties to Russia. The FBI does this unilaterally. And when they tell Rosenstein, he's like, what the heck? How can they do this unilaterally? And how are we going to investigate whether the president is compromised by a foreign adversary? And constitutionally, there's questions about it. The president sets, I mean, look, lawyers will give you 7 different opinions on this, but there's a question about constitutionally whether you can even do that because the president sets foreign policy priorities. It's, it would be an immense, highly invasive investigation into the president of the United States. And what are you going to look at and how are you going to determine? Rosenstein basically thinks that the FBI is out of control, that the FBI is trying to avenge the firing of Comey and they're out to get Trump. And what he does is that he appoints Mueller. And in many ways, in the public's mind, Mueller is appointed because, Rosenstein wants to protect the investigation from the politics of the moment and of Trump. There's some truth to that. Another reason is that Rosenstein wants to keep the investigation away from the FBI because he thinks they're out of control. And by appointing Mueller, he will actually have more control over it than he would if the FBI was in charge of it. So when he takes this investigation that's been opened by the FBI, and when he appoints Mueller and he sits them down to task them, he says, conduct a criminal investigation, figure out whether crimes happened in connection with the 2016 campaign. And by doing it, it's a pretty slick move because what it does is it takes this counterintelligence question about Trump and it kind of takes it kind of sends the Mueller team off in a different direction, and they go off to figure out whether crimes are committed. And Rosenstein says to the Mueller team, if you want to do more, you can come back and ask. But in doing this, he sets the investigation off in a direction that ultimately leads to them not conducting this counterintelligence investigation, whether the Trump president is compromised by his ties to Russia. And the thing that I think is most salient about that is I think that to the average person, if they were following the Mueller investigation, they thought that Mueller was looking at everything about Trump's ties to Russia. We thought that they were looking at, the sale of his mansion in Florida, his, all his business ties, his taxes. That didn't happen. And I think that's a really important part of the whole thing.
Okay, one last question, and then we want to open it up to people who are listening in on the webinar, which is where we are now. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking on the phone, probably about the Mets, I guess. And but at some point, Trump's name came up, and you made a sort of offhand, but I thought very telling comment. You said, he's not leaving, meaning if he loses, he's not leaving the White House. You can Google that notion and find, 50 op-ed pieces that people have written in the last few months about that. But they're written often by professors, academics, people who are opinion columnists. We're not that close to Trump. Maybe probably have never met him. You've been in the trenches with him for the last few years. So what made you say that? What makes you think that if he loses, he's not leaving? And is there anything that would change that calculation now that he's, in your mind now that he's sick? What do you think?
Oh, look, there's nothing I know. It's not like I know something, like I was saying to you, in the sense of like there's something I know about his plans or whatever, or that, I'm trying to predict the future here. What I'm trying to say is that Donald Trump has done nothing by convention throughout his presidency. So why is it that if Donald Trump were to lose the election, he would treat that conventionally like anything else? This is a guy who won the election and said that 3 million people voted illegally for the other person. And that's an election that he's won. So if he won an election and that's how he reacted, and how is he going to react when he loses? And his behavior and his rhetoric around the election, and echoed by his Attorney General, Bill Barr, has been very much so to sow doubt about the election, to sow doubt about mail-in voting, to sow doubt about the results. So why is it, if this person who has not followed any of the norms on pretty much anything in the way of Washington would follow the norms at a point in his presidency where he may be losing the most control, and thinks that he may have some sort of exposure going forward? Regardless of what he's done, he has to be worried about what the president after him would do and investigate about him, even whether that's, you know, in the Southern District of New York, through the feds or the Manhattan DA's office, or, you know, if Biden thinks there's some larger look that has to happen. So why is it that we would assume that he would fall back on convention? And I guess that's my point in the whole thing. You know, I don't know anything, but I think that if you look at the patterns of his behavior, you have to say, well, you know, he hasn't been by the book about anything. Why would he be by the book if he lost?
Okay, well, we have a month to go to the election, and I think Ariel wants to jump back in maybe at this point so we can let some of the webinar participants ask a question. And at the very end, I'd like to ask one more question that really is not about Trump, but I would like to ask Michael at the very end. So go ahead, Ariel.
Thank you so much for that really interesting and thoughtful discussion. I'm getting ready for the Q&A. People are welcome to submit their questions, but I actually have a question for you, Mike. So the challenge of writing a book about current events and breaking news is that the story keeps happening. So if you had a choice, is there one thing or one or two things that you wish you could have included in the book that you didn't get to include that you could share with us today?
I'm going to answer a different version of that question. And that's a question of, like, there's so much that goes on, and it's such a fast moving story. How do you know when to put your pencil down? And how do you know when to stop and say, like, okay, like, I've got enough to write a book? And the thing that I realized about Trump is that the story sort of starts to repeat itself. He does something, the people around him have to make a choice about whether they're going to help him do it, or stop him. There's a confrontation, there's some result, and then he goes on to the next person. And my sense is that Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx are encountering similar situations to what Don McGahn and Jim Comey did. And Trump is sort of this human MRI machine that allows you to see into the souls of the people around him. And my guess is that Fauci sits there and says, well, there's a lot here I don't like, there's a lot here I'm not willing to do, but I think sitting in the passenger seat that my chances of grabbing the wheel maybe once every 30 days are far better than if I quit and a Fox News analyst comes in my wake. And it's the same question as Comey and McGahn. Comey was never going to bend to Trump's will, and that's why he was the first off the island. McGahn was willing to, for different reasons, go along with certain things, but ultimately, comes to a breaking point. And I kind of realized that, and then you see that happen with, Bill Barr. Bill Barr is more willing to do that and not. And I thought that these two characters told that story, and then after a while, the story starts to repeat itself. So I thought, okay, if we can capture these two stories, then we have a larger story here.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And it also goes back to that first thing that you said, which is, why would you think the president would change? after getting sick when nothing else has changed his behavior. It's
Correct.
more the same. So, okay, I have some questions for you. Francis would like to know, were there any back channel communications between Justice Kennedy or anyone associated with him and Don McGahn prior to Kennedy's retirement?
The only thing I know about that I put in the book was that McGahn thought that he could hear in the oral arguments coming out of the court that Kennedy was sort of writing for history, and that this sounded like Kennedy was speaking and writing in ways that showed that this may be his last term, and that convinced McGahn that he thought that Kennedy wanted to retire. He had had a close relationship with Kennedy. He had, a sense of certainly Kennedy's age, and I think knew that Kennedy, the type of judge that Kennedy wanted to see on the court. And McGahn has great political instincts and sensed that moment and jumped on it. And it's if you think you can think it through, if McGahn had left and Kennedy didn't retire, and Kennedy stayed on the court for several more years, and Trump loses and there's a Democratic president, that means that seat could have been replaced by someone that would have had a different view of the world than Kennedy did.
Right. Here's another one from Emily. You were on the New York Times Pulitzer-winning Team for Russia coverage along with Mark Mazzetti and others. What were some of the highs and lows of being part of that team?
So we started pretty slow. And the Washington Post was really at the forefront for the first few months. And that was particularly frightening because it was the biggest story that any of us had ever covered. And we knew that this was it. This was a huge thing. And you only get so many chances to cover big stories. And here we were, the Post was out front, on the Flynn stuff and on the Sessions stuff early on. And we did okay, but we were clearly behind. That's a really, really hard thing to admit to yourself. And I don't even think we admitted it then. And my guess is it even sort of pains me to admit it now. But it took us some months to get to kick into gear. And that's a really, there's some different lonely parts of journalism and of experiences that I've had. But certainly being down to the Washington Post on the biggest story that you're ever going to cover, it's like, it was like the third inning. We looked up and it was 5-0. And, we were able to turn it around. And ultimately we both won the Pulitzer, but those early months were pretty dicey.
Okay, I have another question here for you, slightly less momentous, or maybe it's not. What does the S stand for? This is from Katie.
Samuel. I'm named after my great grandfather, Samuel Cohen, I believe.
Okay, nothing too scary. So any more questions, anybody? Michael is standing by and he's ready, and this is your chance.
I would like to ask one question about the book, Mike, about writing a book. You just described about what it's like feeling you're behind the Washington Post, and then eventually you did great. You're writing a book, so you have a book leave, and yet I think, was it 4 or 5 books have come out about Trump in recent months. Were you aware when you were writing that you were in effect competing all over again, that Woodward was writing a book, that Michael Cohen, Trump's ex-lawyer, was writing a book, that Mary Trump, his niece, was writing a book, and that Andrew Weissman, who you mentioned, has written a book, who was on the investigative team for Mueller? Are you aware of that? Are your editors aware of it at the publishing company? Does that create its own kind of pressure to hurry up?
It does create a pressure, and I think that pushed us to move as quickly as we could. But at the end of the day, besides trying to finish as quickly as you can, there's like nothing you can really do. It's like there's like all you have to do is just bury down on the book that you have and try and finish it. And it's a little different than newspapering, where if we're getting our butts kicked on something, we know we've got to adjust to sort of reposition ourselves and cover something. You know, I mean, you know, it's, I mean, the decision that we made when we were covering drugs in sports, you know, if like, you know, if a, you know, we had these stories that would come out about these pharmacies that were giving players drugs, and we had to try and figure that out because some local paper on the other side of the country was doing something, or the, you know, the tabloids were doing something that, you know, we had to pivot. It's harder to pivot with a book. You just got to finish it. And if you have the voices and thoughts and fears of others in the back of your mind as you're doing it, you're just not going to finish. And a book is, you know, you have to think about a book as a book, and it's not as newspaper story. As newspaper people, we look at the lens largely through one main way, and that is what is new. What is new? What is that new fact that moves the story forward ever so slightly? Sometimes it's a bigger fact and it moves it bigger, and sometimes it's small and moves it only so much. But that's basically what our jobs are: it's looking for that new fact and moving it along and explaining it. With a book, you know, you want new stuff, but it's not as you're there to tell a story, and that's a completely different challenge and different thing. And it's not about everything that's new. And you have to realize, especially in an era in which the news cycles are turning over so quickly and so often, that there's a lot that people don't even remember. You want to have new stuff for your book so you can say you have new stuff, but just taking the pieces and putting them together so people can understand them is one of the great services of a book. And that's a completely different thing than, you know, as we would look at beat reporting on a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And were you,
I have.
do you have another question? Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one is from Maria. Do you ever worry, Mike, do you ever worry or feel threatened by Trump whenever you get too close to a story that will harm Trump?
No, I mean, I think that there are some unusual different challenges here with a president who calls the media the enemy of the people. I think that that is different, and that galvanizes his supporters in ways that are potentially dangerous to journalists. I sort of realize that there's only so much I can control about that. You know, look, the Obama Justice Department went after reporters. You know, the Trump Justice Department has in different ways gone after the media. Trump's rhetoric is obviously far different than Obama's rhetoric. He uses the bullhorn of the presidency against the media in ways that galvanizes his supporters against us. So that is in the back of my head in ways that are different than before. I don't think that deters us in what we do, but I think we just have to, you know, think about our own safety and security a little differently. But you know, so yeah, I guess that's sort of the biggest fear I have in that area.
Here's another one. Thank you, Mike. This one is from Kim. What is your overall impression of the Trump presidency? In 2 words or less, right? That's a hard one, but.
I mean, it is. I think if I had a, I think if I don't know about impression, but conclusion is that we're much more of a society of norms than we are of a society of laws. And I think that we often thought that we were a society of laws, where, like, you know, it's like the law was the law, and it kind of provided this great clarity, especially for how the president behaved, and that sort of governed the executive office. And I think that you see that if the president is willing to act in ways that other presidents are, that they can flaunt a lot of that. It comes down to norms. It's like, how willing is the president to follow norms of his predecessors? And so to me, you know, it's been more about norms. You know, it's like, well, you could never fire you could never fire, this is not a legal question, but well, actually it might be a legal question, but you can't fire your FBI director in the middle of an investigation into you. You know, people say you could never do that. Well, Trump, that would be a norm. Trump just shattered that. And by his willingness to shatter that, he had a lot of impact, and that sort of being the first event of many. But so I just think that we are more of a society of norms than of laws.
Okay, thank you. Now, here are two questions that are very similar. One is by Lauren and one is by Pace. So what can be done if Trump refuses to leave the White House, if he won't accept the election results and says that they're rigged?
Well, I think that legally, I think he runs into a difficult space, because I think legally, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court swears in who has been certified as the president through the Electoral College process. And like, even if the president wouldn't leave the White House, that let's say if Biden won, that he would become president, and that the executive branch would respond to him. But it's obviously super uncharted territory. And maybe it's just the fact that Trump is able to sow doubt about the election and about the results. And, maybe state legislators don't want to go along with I'm just throwing out possibilities here, but by sowing that doubt and by using the bullhorn of the presidency for that to seep down, who knows what the impact of that could be. Maybe the impact is simply that, Trump leaves, but he's done enough to undermine the legitimacy of the election, and that gives his supporters something to hold on to for the next 4 years. So I just think we're in super uncharted territory in the whole thing, including constitutionally.
Thank you. This one is from Saul. We still haven't heard a definitive answer about Trump's relationship to Russia. How would you handicap the odds that Trump is being blackmailed by Putin, and whether there is financial misdeeds where Russian money was funneled to Trump related to the golf courses, etc., or something else?
So I wouldn't put an odds on it. I would just say that the fact that the question has not been answered authoritatively by Mueller, it was answered to some extent by a Senate intelligence report that came out several weeks ago. The fact that there has not been that accounting allows for that question to persist. It allows for people to still wonder. Look, if you investigated someone, you would never know every connection that they have. But the fact of the matter is, by Mueller not doing it, it allows that notion to fester, and for the question to continue to fester. Maybe there's nothing there, and Trump would have benefited from a thorough investigation into this. But the fact that there was no investigation allows us to continue to wonder. And my sense is that without that sort of authoritative investigation, we'll spend, several decades to come, with like, oh, well, we found out this about Trump and Russia, or we found out this about Trump and Russia. There'll be this sort of post-presidency litigation of, what his ties were to Russia in ways that America has looked at other, questions of major events of presidencies before, in which there was no clarity and there was deep skepticism amongst the population. So I think the question will go on for a long time because there hasn't been that authoritative investigation.
Okay. So here's an interesting one from Francis. Why did Comey announce he would reopen the Clinton investigation so close to the election?
So you can read the book for that. No, Comey felt Comey's rationale was that they had basically told Congress that they had completed this investigation and that they were going to have to go back and do investigating, and that they had a duty to inform Congress that the circumstances around this had changed given his commitment to Congress. There was differing views inside the FBI about whether he should do this, but I think and Comey thought that if the FBI was seen as concealing information from Congress, it would be looked at as helping Clinton get elected, and that the stain of that on the FBI would have been far greater than if he did disclose it to the public.
Right.
And like many people, Comey, he didn't make the decision based on this, but I think he assumed that Hillary was going to win.
Okay.
Mike, can Ariel, I wanted to ask one amazing
Another-
tidbit in your book
Jay,
about.
I have a whole bunch of other questions to get
Oh,
to.
okay. Let me get to. I had one amazing tidbit about Comey, but I'll wait. Go ahead. Go.
Okay. So how long did it take you to write the book? This is from Karen.
It took about 2 years, off and on for 2 years, and then sort of a sprint in the past 6 months, and that was the final 6 months before it was sold. And it was a far more taxing experience than I ever thought it would be. But it took about 2 years, but about 6 months at the end of really grinding away at it on a day-to-day basis. If journalism is, if daily newspaper journalism is dribbling with your right hand and your left hand, your right hand being reporting and your left hand being writing, writing a book is like all is being on the basketball court and has to do all different things. It's many different decisions that have to be made about the arc of the book and about storytelling and how to come at a story and what's new and what's compelling and what's not. You got to have a bank shot, a three-point shot, a foul shot, a layup. It tests you in ways that I certainly hadn't been tested in day-to-day newspaper.
Okay. I'm sorry I interrupted you, Jay. Do you want to ask the question?
It's just a very little intriguing. Sure. Mike, at one point you say that Comey's wife and their daughters go to the Women's March before Trump's inauguration, which it was startling to read that. I mean, it's very human that, he's got a wife and daughters with minds of their own. Did Trump know this? I assume he didn't, and he probably still does not, unless somebody told him after reading your book, right? He probably had no idea that Comey's wife and daughters had gone to this march. Is that correct?
Yeah, and my guess is in Trump's mind, what other things Comey did to him were far more, in Trump's mind, would be far more infuriating to him than that. Whether it was keeping the memos or leaking the memos or, testifying the way that he did or whatever. My guess is that Trump, that would probably bother Trump, but I don't know I don't think he knew about it at the time.
Okay.
But in the book, Comey presented a pretty big challenge to tell the story, because as you pointed out earlier, many people don't know Don McGahn, and so telling his story is really a fresh story. Everybody knows who Jim Comey is. A certain percentage of the population has made up their mind about him in terms of Hillary Clinton. A certain percentage of the population has made up their mind about him in terms of Trump. Jim Comey wrote a book. He testified before Congress. We've written countless stories about him. So in terms of storytelling, that was pretty difficult. And to relate to him, people had already made up their mind about him. And also, you and I, we're never going to be the FBI director. So it's hard to relate to that. To understand his story, he says, come back to October 28th with me of 2016 to see what I saw. Well, I've never been the FBI director. I'm not going to be. It's hard for me to understand that. So what I realized with Comey was that to make sure that story was fresh, we had to come at it at a different angle, because we've all been looking at him at a sort of a 90-degree angle. And that's why I tell the story of Comey through his wife, to try and move the camera, move the lens, and look at him from a different way. We do not know what it's like to be the FBI director. We do know what it's like to watch a loved one suffer through something. So here is his wife watching her husband, who she believes stands for all that's good and righteous about Washington being blamed for the election of someone like Donald Trump, who she thinks is an existential threat to the country. So let's tell the story through someone else. So maybe, and part of me is like, I don't want to tell the Comey story, but the Comey is so important to where we are in this country and decisions that he made. And so I thought historically he was really important. So if we're going to tell the story, we got to tell it from a different angle.
Right. And in fact, I have a question here from Lenny saying, I get why McGahn was key. Please go over more about Comey. Is it that Don stayed and Comey couldn't live with it? Was that like the distinction between those two stories for you?
I think that it just shows what I was trying to show is that, like, the other thing is that, like, I didn't want to turn the book into like Trump, like, here's something else crazy Trump did, here's something else crazy Trump did. I thought that those sort of books have been told, and I'm not sure how helpful they are to understanding him. So I thought that telling the story about the people around him and how they responded to this unusual phenomenon of the president behaving in such unprecedented ways was super much more informative and helpful. And you see different, you see two different people, sort of the moralist Comey, who's going to follow that moralism as far as could be, and is not going to bend to Trump. And then in someone in McGahn, who was going to come to the trough of the Trump presidency and was going to walk away with the politically biggest victory, basically remaking the federal courts for ways that will impact the country for decades. I thought that, we live in Jim Comey's America today because of decisions that he made, whether it was in regards to Trump or Hillary or Russia investigation. And I think we will be living in Don McGahn's America for 40 years to come.
And there are a number of questions here about judges. So this one is from Jeannie. If judges were of paramount importance and everyone knew that Trump was incompetent and dangerous, why not let impeachment go through and have the same results with Pence? Isn't the enabling manifestly irresponsible in context of their goals? Not really sure.
I think that's, the point is that, like, if the judges are so important, wouldn't Pence, you could make the argument that, like, if you replace Trump with Pence, wouldn't he, follow the same thing? Sure, to a certain extent. But I just think that the party, that the Republican members of Congress, Republican politicians, do not totally understand the base and are afraid of the base. The base has become so tethered to the president that they're afraid to do anything to break with that. And, I think that they're shocked by how much the base has gone along with the president and are afraid to cross the president because of that, because they don't understand what the base is willing and not willing to go along with. So I think the judges is an important part of creating that bond. I understand why logically, that, but I think that the Republican Party, if they were in after, they've been in after a lot of behavior that they've gone along with. I don't know if there was something that would turn them off to the president.
Okay, here's another one about judicial stuff from Lisa. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm curious if you think Amy Coney Barrett will indeed be confirmed to the Supreme Court.
Look, I think that it was going to be difficult for them to do. I think everything had to go perfectly for them before all this stuff happened with this outbreak. And I thought there was a shot that they could do that, but everything had to go perfectly. And now there's a huge factor. You've got some senators, including some on the Judiciary Committee, that have this, and you've got a president. Who knows what his actual health status is. So I think when you introduce such a variable into it, it's just, they needed to for everything to line up perfectly for it to happen. I think there was a shot that was going to happen, but now there's just there's a big variable in there. But look, McConnell's super effective. He's been very, very effective. So I wouldn't put it past him.
Hey, I have, gosh, there's so many of them. After all the negative, this is from Pace again. After all the negative news about Trump, why doesn't Biden have a greater lead?
Well, there was a poll out today that showed that he was up 13%, 13 points, 13 points nationally in the latest poll. But I mean, that's the question. I just think that's a larger political question of the Trump moment. It's like, why is it that Trump's popularity has persisted, and why is it that he's defeated so many obstacles in front of him in ways that other politicians haven't? And I think we're going to need the help of history to really look back and answer that question. But I think that's something we'll be asking ourselves for a long time to come.
And then this one is from Barbara. Are we likely to see a story about potential lawsuits against Trump from sexual harassment to treason that we might see in the future?
I mean, I think we will be looking at Trump legal issues for many years to come. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff in the courts in terms of just on the issue of sexual harassment, where the president's in litigation in different cases. So, and those things will not be resolved by election day. And if he were to lose, they will continue unless they were to be settled. So I think that whether it's that or it's the questions of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which clearly wants to do some sort of investigation into the president, Trump legal issues, I don't see going anywhere.
Okay, here's another one. This one is from Daphne. What can you say at record keeping in the White House? What are the legal requirements and are they being met?
Well, I mean, I think you get into a question here. It's like, well, what are they required to do and what do they do? Are they preserving all of their documents under, the National Archives, stuff? I don't know. There was a story a year or two ago about how they had to go at the White House into the trash to find documents that Trump was throwing out that he shouldn't throw out. Certainly other politicians have had problems with record keeping in White Houses that were more sort of more diligent on issues like this. So I can only assume that I don't know. I mean, I would look at that issue with some skepticism about whether they're following all that. There have been reports about White House officials using different private email accounts or messaging apps that aren't necessarily backed up by the White House systems. And records keeping in any presidency is a difficult thing.
Okay, I have a whole bunch of questions here. I'm going to clump them about journalism of one sort or another. Here's one that's an interesting one. Esther wants to know, how did Obama go after the media?
So the Obama administration, Justice Department, brought more prosecutions against leakers or convictions against leakers than any other previous president. And I believe, I want to double check this, but I believe more than all the other presidents combined. So they prosecuted leak investigations more aggressively than any other president. And obviously that has a direct impact on reporters. There was a Times reporter who was under subpoena for much of the Obama administration. That type of thing is has a chilling effect on journalism. Yes.
Well, and here's one from Lauren about newspapers in general. Newspapers generally are struggling, many are closing. How can print or other media recover from being tagged as fake news for this entire administration, and when so many are not swayed by truth?
The thing I'd say about that is that the Times has come down positioned better than, better than ever I could have imagined, and incredibly strong way. We're more read today than we've ever been. We've built a model around our business that's based on subscriptions that insulates us a bit from the ups and downs of the advertising market, and is a really powerful force as the company moves to have 10 million, hopefully 10 million subscribers, digitally and otherwise to our product. And I think that the Times influence in place is as important as it's ever been. Unfortunately, in the rest of the newspaper industry, that has not had that case and has been really decimated by this. I don't know what the answer to that is. And I think that in a larger sense, it is a damaging thing to have the most person with the biggest bullhorn in the country to say fake news over and over again. I think that's a damaging thing. And I think that Trump has tested us in ways that we could never have come up with on a whiteboard in a journalism or law class. And that's just one of them. And I'm not sure what the answer is.
Okay. Here's another one. This is interesting. This one is from Gerald. Most books start from a point of view or criticism about President Trump. Objectivity is a critical element of persuasiveness. How do you as a journalist maintain and demonstrate that objectivity?
So there, the journalism that I practice is, you just follow the facts and wherever they're going to go. And I wasn't going to do anything differently in my own book. I think that, that's my job, and that's what I'm here to do. And did as a newspaper reporter, I was going to do that in the book. And I think that type of journalism is really essential to the moment. There's more than enough opinions about Donald Trump on both sides. No one needs to hear what my opinion of him is. And I try to just look at Donald Trump for the facts and covering a story, and not as someone that needs to have an opinion about him. I think that we're best served by having journalists that are just trying to follow the story as much as possible.
You mean like to focus on behavior rather than character as
No, I just mean about follow, we're here to follow the facts and tell the story, and to capture the moment, capture him and what he's done and why he does it, and try and explain it as much as possible. The public does not need our opinions of Donald Trump. They need it for the story.
Here's one that's kind of sweet, actually. When you started in journalism, was your passion to report on sports? Did you ever imagine that your focus would change as radically as it did? What did your high school self think you would be doing when you finished college?
I think that the job that I had in sports, and I think Jay would probably find this interesting, I think that was probably the best job that I ever had, because I was working at the Times, and I was covering drugs in sports, and most reporters didn't want to cover that, whether that was at the Times or at other places. So that, and sports, unlike Washington, has far less oversight. Like in Washington, there's two parties, an inspector general and a bunch of media, and oversight groups and Congress and all sorts of stuff. So you can't do anything without someone blowing the whistle. In sports, there's like no oversight. And there's most reporters don't want to be part of that coverage either. They want to go to the stadium and write about the games and such. So sports is rife. There's a lot of money on the line, and people are there for a range of reasons. Some to make money, some because they're really good at sports, for a range of things. So there's a lot more bad behavior and a lot less people covering it. So I mean, not that there's more bad behavior than there is in Washington, but it's just sort of out there in a way that's different, and it's accessible in a way that's a little bit easier. So I worked, Jay and I were really into this story, and we had a ton of freedom from Tom Jolly, probably too much, so it's at times, and I would probably admit, and but the freedom, more importantly, the freedom from Tom to sort of go out and just follow the story where we wanted to follow it. which is a really important thing from a boss. And there was just a lot there, and a lot of freedom, and you still got to work at the Times and within the system of the Times, which is incredibly beneficial to amplifying your work. And so I really miss that.
Well, actually, that leads right into Katie's question. How different were your relationships with editors in charge of the three vastly different beats you've been on: sports, Iraq, and national security?
I think it's more driven by the personality of the editor, and sort of at times the intensity of the story than anything else. Jay and I were really into covering this story, and sort of matched up perfectly on that. You don't always match up so perfectly with an editor, where you're both so driven to cover something and interested in doing that and have the ability to do that. So it sort of matched up in a way that was unusual and different. We may have taken it too far at times, but it certainly got us, pretty, far into it. And it was also like, it was a great story at that moment. Like if I had been the, Mets beat writer at the time, would have been a less interesting story because the Mets were not as good, or they were less relevant. But it was a really important moment in the stuff that we were covering. We sort of recognized that, and we're both interested in that and had the freedom to do that. And that just doesn't always line up like that.
Right. Okay. This is a quite a serious question. So it's sort of taking us back to some material we've already covered, but I think it's really important. This is from Thomas. With Barrett's confirmation of virtual certainty and the new court's first priority being to eliminate the ACA and throw 20 million people off their health care in the midst of a deadly pandemic, what do you foresee this new SCOTUS terraforming our country into a second golden age where Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security unions, free elections, and the like are relegated to the dustbins of history? I think that's a question.
So a lot there. I'm not an expert on the court or on the legal issues that surround the really important political issues of the day as much, but I guess I would say that the election really matters. It really matters, and the court really matters, and McGahn's behavior has shown that. Trump's embracing of trying to remake the federal courts has shown that, and it would be very interesting to see how whether the Democrats win back control and are faced with a conservative judiciary, what that looks like, and would you have a new, even more adversarial relationship between the branches if they're even more polarized. So I don't think that's a satisfying answer, but it's the court matters.
Well, without a crystal ball, it's hard to answer definitively, I think. But here's another question, which is more of a matter of opinion, and this is from Francis. If Trump loses the election, should the Democrats immediately try to impeach him so that he can never run for office again, which might be a goal Republicans in Congress might also want to achieve?
I don't know. If Trump were to lose, he would, so he's, what is he, 74, 75 plus 9, 79. So he'd run again at 79 or 80. My guess is that the Congress would put their efforts elsewhere. But I think it highlights a larger issue of what will the political pressure be on the Democrats if Trump were to lose to investigate Trump. What would that look like? Will there be some, push for there to be a commission, for Biden to appoint a commission to look at the Trump era? Will Congress feel the need to do that? Will the Justice Department feel the need to do that? What will the politics of the Justice Department look like? Who will the Attorney General be? If the Attorney General is someone who has had a very partisan tone in the past few years, does that change things? I don't know.
Okay, so here's another one from Ansi. So what's your next book about?
I have to forget the pain of this book to even think about another book.
It's like childbirth for women, right? You have to forget the pain. Okay, I have a lot of people here saying thank you. Thanks, Mike and Jay from Patty. Very interesting program from Pace. And here's one. I think I'll end with this one from Lenny. I'm convinced I'll order the book and go for it after I finish the cast.
Fantastic. One book at a time. One book at a time, as I say.
Ariel, if it's okay, I just want to spend 1 minute asking Mike a last question because it's not about Trump. It's at the, we can use the end to go back to the beginning. It's your dedication in the book, which is to your cousin, Marine Corps Lance Corporal John Taylor Schmidt III, who died on the battlefield. Can you elaborate a little bit more on who he was?
So John Schmidt was born, about 3 weeks before I was, in September of 1983. And we knew each other as children. We had the same great grandmother, and then our lives went in separate directions. And in 2005, he was in Fallujah, where there was an explosion in a building he was in. There was ammonia that caught fire and breathed in this ammonia, and it scarred the inside of his lungs. And he was taken back to Texas, where he eventually died. And I went to his funeral, and it's not hard if someone was born 3 weeks before you, living through the post 9/11 era, to see someone, die like that and not wonder, if the ball bounced differently, if that could be you. Fast forward 6 years later, I spent a year in Iraq, and came out of that with an even deeper appreciation and understanding of the military, and of the fragility of life and then being in that type of situation, and the thoughts of John Schmidt and how life could easily be different, or something that have lived with me for a long time. I have spent time at his grave at Arlington National Cemetery since I moved to Washington, and I think that folks in my generation paid a far greater price than others, including folks like myself, who didn't have to go and fight in these wars that were fought after 9/11. And I see the 9/11 is obviously a profound event for folks in my generation, and I think that it's easy. It's not easy to forget, but I think that anytime that we can remind ourselves and those around us about the price that these people paid in these wars is really important. So that's why I dedicated the book to them.
Well, that's lovely. And I'm going to close here with one final question from Francis. Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. Thank you, Montclair Public Library and Michael, for the unique opportunity to ask questions directly to such an esteemed journalist. We really feel the same. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
For coming on. And I have a few other things to say. Donald Trump, and thanks to everybody for joining us today, because there's no program without you guys. Donald Trump versus the United States is available for sale at our partner Watch on Booksellers, and it's also available to borrow through the library. There are links, and there's more information on the handout that's attached to this webcast. And we hope that you'll join us for our next event, which will be on Sunday, October 25th at 4 p.m. for prize-winning journalist Jonathan Alter in conversation with Jim Axelrod of CBS News for Jonathan's new biography of Jimmy Carter, His Very Best. We'll send details about that event to all of today's attendees. Be well, and we hope to see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.